No, Steve?
For the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel, you may continue with cross-examination.
Sir, one of the things that you told me was that this was not suggestive to you of borderline personality disorder, correct? That's what you told me, right?
I said you could not use this scale to diagnose borderline, correct?
No, I'm asking you whether or not this is indicative of borderline personality disorder.
No, it is not.
I want you to take a look at another exhibit then.
Yes, sir?
Sir, are you familiar with somebody by the name of Timothy J. Troll?
No, not personally.
Are you familiar with the Psychological Assessment, a journal of consulting and clinical psychology?
Yes, somewhat.
And with regard to, are you familiar with an article entitled Discriminant Validity of the MMPI Borderline Personality Disorder Scale?
Not off the top of my head.
Well, why don't you go ahead and take a look at page number 234 and take a look at table 2 that's at the bottom of that article.
Yes, sir.
Judge, may we approach?
You may.
You just wanted me to be basically familiar with it and not read the entire article, I assume.
Right.
Yes, sir?
All right, if I may have it, Pat.
Yes, sir.
This has a table number 2, involving the K-corrected MMPI inventory T-scores, doesn't it?
Yes, sir.
And what does K-corrected mean to you?
It's actually correcting the profile of certain scales based on the level of defensiveness, the K scale, that the person had.
And in fact, it's you keep looking down. Are you looking at something else?
No, I'm looking at the same thing.
And sir, this talks about the MMPI, and it involves scores for borderline personality disorder, right?
Yes, sir.
Major depression, right?
Yes, sir.
Dysthymia, right?
Dysthymia.
Dysthymia, right?
Yes, sir.
Bipolar disorder, right?
Yes, sir.
And cyclothymia, right?
I believe so, yes.
Pardon?
I believe so.
And schizophrenia, right?
Yes, sir.
And also schizoaffective disorder and diagnostic groups, right?
I believe so.
And then there's a column there for borderline personality disorder, right?
Yes, sir.
And the norm, or the number of people that they looked at was 61, right?
Yes, sir.
And then it looked at these scales that we're looking at here, correct?
Yes, sir.
It looked at the F scale, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in this article, the F scale was elevated, right?
You mean the average you're talking about there?
No, well, yes. The
Yes.
average F score was elevated, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, we have an elevated score here, correct?
I would need to do one more thing. I think that may be on the MMPI 1, so they're different scales. I'd have to, if I could look at that for a second, I just need to know.
Well, I'm asking you whether or not this is an elevated score, sir.
Yes, this is elevated, but there's two different things. The
I understand. So is this an elevated F score?
This one, correct, is.
Right? And with regard to number 2, which you told me was what?
Number 2?
Right here. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, scale 2.
Right?
Depression.
And with regard to depression, this is elevated, correct?
Objection. Judge Newman, approach.
Yes, you may approach.
And we have this elevation here under the D portion, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that you said was depression, right?
Yes, sir.
HY, also an elevation, right?
Yes, sir.
PD, also an elevation, right?
Yes, sir.
MF is not elevated, that's male, female, right?
Masculinity, femininity.
PA is elevated, right?
Yes, sir.
PT is elevated, right?
Yes, sir.
And SC is elevated, right?
Yes, sir.
And so is the MA, right?
Correct.
One of the things that, or the issues that you raised was, well, this study refers to the MMPI-1, right?
I didn't know. I needed to refresh my
Well,
memory. I didn't
assuming
look
it
at that.
does refer to the MMPI-1, correct? Let's assume it does refer to that.
Oh.
You're saying that just because it refers to the MMPI-1, it has no application to this particular scale at all?
No, the scored, the reason I was asking is you see this has a cutoff of 65, but the MMPI-1 had a cutoff of 70. So whether it's clinically elevated, which was I was trying to ask on the article, I had to go back and look compared to 70 rather than 65.
Okay. So this, I want you to take a look at and see whether or not the numerical scales are above 70. That's what you're asking about, right?
Correct. Yes, all the ones that you had highlighted are above 70. That's or 70 or above.
Correct. Which makes this a valid study to look at, even though we are now doing MMPI-2, right?
Yes.
And this indicates that of 61 people that had borderline person,
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled.
isn't it true that of the 61 people that were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, every one of them had the identical or similar profile that we have here that we've been talking about?
No, sir.
Well, the F scale is 72.77 on this exhibit, isn't it? 651.
Yes, sir.
What is the F number for the defendant in exhibit number 631?
79. Yes.
So this F scale is above the clinical threshold of 70 that you talked about, right?
Yes, sir.
With regard to the number 2, the D, which is depression, correct?
Yes, sir.
The level here on the study was 80.43, right?
Yes, sir.
That's above the 70 cutoff line, right?
That is correct.
And then number 3, which is the HY, isn't it true that in this study it was 70.05?
Yes.
Right?
Yes, sir.
That's above the 70
Well,
marker,
that's
right?
at 70. That's still clinical.
But it's still clinical. Number 4, which was the PD, right?
Yes, sir.
That was at 79.75, right?
Yes, sir.
Number 6 was 73.15, right?
Well, I am actually assuming you're reading it, so I'm not going to. I'm assuming you're reading me the same
sure.
number, so I would say
understand.
yes.
And number 7 was 72.34, right? Assuming I'm reading it correctly.
Yes, sir.
And number 8 was 79.20, right?
Yes, sir.
So if we assume that the cutoff is 70, the threshold on the F scale is met, correct? To be clinical, right?
Yes, sir.
The scales on the others, that we've just talked about, are also clinical because they're above 70, right?
Yes, sir. Or
So-
at or above.
And this study indicates that those with borderline personality disorder had that type of graph, for lack of a better term. Yes or no?
Can't answer that yes or no because you're
Okay,
asking.
then thank you.
Okay.
Sir, with regard to the, one of the other items that you talked about was this trauma symptom inventory test. You remember talking about that?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated that this was to identify trauma in the past involving somebody, correct?
Well, not necessarily past. It could have just occurred, but if you're defining that as past, yes.
And do you know somebody by the name of John Breer, PhD?
Yes, sir.
He's actually the person that put it together, right?
Yes, sir.
And are you familiar with what his psychometric summary is in terms of applying the TSI to borderline personality disorder?
I don't recall that one. I'd have to look
Pardon?
at it. I don't recall that one. I'd have to look at it.
So what was your opinion previously that you gave us with regard to this TSI? You indicated previously that it was indicative of post-traumatic stress disorder rather than borderline personality disorder, correct?
I don't think I said it that strong, but that's the general idea.
That was the general idea that you left us with, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's take a look at this exhibit. And so that we know what we're talking about when we talk about the TSI, this is exhibit number 644. Do you remember that?
I didn't know the number, but I
This
know
is
that.
it, right?
Yes, sir.
And this is the one that you indicated that, well, there were the summary scales on there that Dr. DeMarty did not include, right?
Yes, sir.
And you indicated that, sure, somebody, if they're hand scoring it, in your opinion, they should always have the summary scales attached to it, right?
Not in my opinion. It's provided in the manual how to score it.
So you believe that the manual indicates that even if you hand score it, that is something that you are required to do?
Required isn't the way that would be the correct terminology for any test. It would say that in order to use this test, here are the scales, and here's how you devise the summary scales. I don't think somebody's going to say you're required to do anything on a test. You're given it to get information, and here's the information you can get. So it's just not a terminology we would use.
Have you ever hand scored one of these?
Oh, yes.
When was the last time you did it?
Well, last time I probably hand scored a TSI would be probably about 8-10 years ago.
And at that time, you did the summary scales, right?
Yes, we did.
No, you keep saying we. Did you do it, or did somebody else?
It would well, in all these settings, I've had staff, so I would train them how, and then they would do it for practice and to learn how.
And so it is your view that you're sure about this issue involving the summary scales as you are about everything else. In other words, that the person who put this test together indicates strongly that these summary scales should be created as part of giving this test, if you hand scoring it.
That's, again, language that doesn't make sense. No, I haven't talked to John specifically
No, I'm
about...
not asking you if you talked to John. I'm asking what your understanding is. Is it your belief, as you sit here today, that the people that put this test out, you didn't create it, right?
That's correct.
That the people who created this test are saying, if you hand score this test, you are required, strongly required, to also create, as part of this hand scoring, these summary scales.
No, I don't recall reading any statement that would be stated the way you just did.
Well, what is the statement that you recall that it says?
Just instructions on how to obtain the summary scores if you're hand scoring.
Right. But instructions are different than a recommendation. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, you don't get recommendations per se in instruction manuals. You get in the manuals instructions on how to use the test, how to score it, how to interpret it. So I don't think it gives you like recommendations from the
Right, but
standpoint.
what you're saying is that there are instructions on how to prepare these summary scales, but that's what it says. That's what they are, instructions on how to do it, if you want to do it, right?
Well, if you leave out the last three words, if you want to do it, it just says, here's how you obtain these summary scales, and then it tells you how to interpret it.
But your view is that just because the instructions are there, it's bad work on the part of Janine DeMarte because she did not do the summary scales. That's what you told us, right?
No. Oh, shoot.
Go ahead and clean up, please.
Sorry about that. I was doing so well. Could you repeat that
Go
again?
ahead and finish up. I understand you.
Okay.
We were talking about instructions
Yes, sir.
involving the TSI and the summary scales.
Yes, sir.
And what you're telling us is that what you remember from the manual is that there are instructions to this TSI that would tell the psychologist how to create these summary scales should they choose to do so.
Yeah, if they're hand scoring is what you're asking.
Right, if they're hand scoring it, because
Yes,
you
sir.
did this by computer, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what you're saying now, though, is that there is no specific language in those instructions that indicates that it is mandatory to provide summary scales, right?
That is correct.
So this added requirement, or this, not added requirement, this statement on your part that Janine DeMarte did a bad job because she didn't do the summary scales was based on your view that it should be done, not on what the manual says.
You've asked me two questions in there. First, I never used the word bad, period. So,
Oh, you were very glowing about Janine DeMarte's work? Is that what you're telling me?
no, I believe the word that was asked.
No. Were you glowing about Janine DeMarte's work?
Was I glowing?
Yes. Were you praiseful? Did you praise her work on the stand?
Not that I can recall.
No, you actually criticized her work from the stand, right?
Some of it, yes.
And one of the things that you criticized from the stand involved the TSI, right?
Yes, sir.
And you criticized the fact that she did not have summary scales, right?
Only partially.
The answer is yes, you did criticize, didn't you? You said she should have done it, right?
I said two things. I said, yes, they are part of that, and yes, she should have known they were part of it. I didn't criticize her for not requiring to do it. I criticized part of it because she didn't evidently know they were there or understand what they were. That's the criticism.
How do you know that she didn't know what she needed to do? How do you know? Can you read mine, sir?
Objection argumentative.
Sir, you didn't speak to Janine DeMarte about it, did you?
No, sir.
You never asked her whether or not she knew about the supplementary scale, the summary scales, did you?
No, sir.
And in fact, you never saw anything in writing that indicated from her that said she didn't know, right?
Objection. May we approach?
Yes, you may approach.
to DeMarte, you reviewed her report, right?
Yes, sir.
Nowhere did it indicate in there that she didn't have any knowledge about this, that it was a requirement that this TSI have these summary scales, right?
There was no indication of anything about the summary scales in her report.
That's right. And just because there's no indication in there doesn't mean she's ignorant of it, does it?
No, sir, it does not.
You made that leap, didn't you?
No, sir.
Well, you made that leap based on what? You read her report, right?
Yes, sir.
And then you read the results to the TSI, right?
Yes, sir.
And those are the only things that were provided to you, according to you, involving this TSI and the summary scales, right?
Those were the only materials provided to me, not the only information provided to me.
And in any of those materials, did they provide any indication that Janine DeMarte was ignorant of this requirement that you believe exists?
You keep saying requirement, and I never indicated it was required first. So, no, I never used the term required. Word required is not used in any of the manuals. So that's the first part.
Thank you.
The second part is, was I provided any materials that indicated that she did not know what the summary scales were or that they existed? No, I was not provided materials that said that.
Now, sir, with regard to the summary scale, so that we know what we're talking about,
Yes, sir.
if we're talking about summary scales, aren't they just 3 readings, right? We're talking about 3 readings, right?
You'd have to define what you mean by
Well,
readings.
let me just show you Exhibit 646.
Yes, sir.
And count with me. 1, 2, 3, right?
Yeah, we don't call them readings, we call them scales.
Well, there are 3 areas that have a summary, right? They're called summary scales for a reason, right?
That is correct.
Because they summarize what's in this box to the left, correct?
Yes, sir.
So you have 10 areas or sites that the test addresses, correct?
Yes, sir.
You have 10 readings, correct?
Readings is not a good term. It's 10 scales, yes,
All right,
we
let's
do.
use the word, there's 10 scales that are reported, correct?
Yes, sir. Well, 10.
10 plus the validity scales.
Yes,
I
sir.
understand.
Yes, sir.
But you have the 10 scales. And then you have these 3 scales to the right. Is that the word you want to use?
Thank you. Yes, sir.
And with regard to these 3 scales to the right, what they merely do is they summarize what those 10 scales are there, what those 10 scales say, right?
Well, if you leave out the word merely, the answer would be yes.
So they do summarize what's here, right?
Yes, sir.
In other words, what you're saying is somebody can take a look at this, which is the full scales, right? These are the full scales, right?
Yes.
And this is sort of the shortcut scales, right?
Again, shortcut is not a good term.
I understand it's not a shortcut, but the term summary means it's not the whole thing, doesn't it?
It means it's based on a compilation of other things.
But if someone as experienced as you is a clinical psychologist or is an expert in this, to be honest, you don't really need these summary scales. You're way too smart for that, right?
Objection argumentative.
Sir, you can do it. You've had how many years of experience in this?
In trauma or in this
No,
test?
no, no. Total experience in the field of psychology.
35.
And in those 35 years, you've dealt with this TSI test, haven't you?
No, the TSI was produced probably in the research version a little over 20 years ago.
So you've dealt with this for many years, right?
That is correct.
Whether it's the TSI-1 or the TSI-2, you've dealt with it for, what, 20 years?
Yeah, a long time.
And in those 20 years, you've given this test many times.
Yes, sir.
And many times you've been able to take a look at all of these scales here, 1 through 10, whatever they are, and you know what they mean, right?
Yes, sir.
So you're saying that you need the summary to be able to tell you what these scales mean?
No. The
Thank you.
scale. Okay.
Now, with regard to the this trauma symptom inventory, which is 646, you indicated that this was just, not just, but this is one of the tests that looks at trauma, right?
Yes, sir, trauma symptoms,
Right, it doesn't look at personality like the MMPI, right?
correct.
Because MMPI stands for what? Minnesota Multi-State Personality, right?
Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory.
Right, but the term there is personality, right? That's what it's looking at, right?
Yes,
And that's one of the most studied tests around, correct?
yes, sir.
And is this a test that's studied a lot, this TSI?
Well, a lot, yes. A lot, if you're using MMPI, there's probably nothing as much as the MMPI, but this has been pretty well studied.
And this one right here, this looks at the trauma as reported by the person who's taking the test, right?
The symptoms, yes.
Right, the symptoms that we're talking about. And some of the symptoms that you told us were what, for example?
Well, those scales would be anxious arousal, depression, defensive avoidance, dissociation, sexual concerns, dysfunctional sexual behavior, and impaired self-reference. I'm assuming you're asking me for the
Sure.
clinically significant scales.
And then we have DSB here.
Yes,
What is that?
dysfunctional sexual behavior.
And for example, what do those questions ask?
In general, without giving you the exact questions, they ask about the person's behavior sexually, roughly like, are they satisfied with the number of partners? Do they have any type of
Well, let me help you.
unpleasant behaviors or things that they're dysfunctional, unprotected sex, too many partners? Those types of things go into what would be called dysfunctional sexual behavior.
And the person who's taking the test is given a number from 0 to 3, right, to fill in.
Yes, sir.
And 0 means never, right?
Yes, sir.
And 3 means often, right?
Yes, sir.
And so, for example, in question 28 of the TSI, it asks,
Objection. Huey Bush.
That's good.
Yes.
Sir, you indicated that you reviewed a TSI that was administered by Dr. Karp, correct?
The report by Dr. Karp, yes.
And you indicated that the profile there, which is what we have here, right?
You have a profile
Right.
here, that is correct.
Didn't you tell us that the results in Dr. Karp's testing, or the TSI, were the same or consistent as what we have in 646? Didn't you tell us that?
No, I said of the scales elevated here, you have 7 that are
Right.
elevated. 5 of those were the same elevations she had, according to her report. One, this intrusive, I'm touching it, it's not helping you. The intrusive experiences one in her report was clinical, and it's below that. And she did not indicate that either of these two, the sexual concern, I'm sorry, hit the wrong thing. Sexual concerns and dysfunctional sexual behavior, she did not indicate were in the clinical
She didn't
range.
indicate what your,
She did not indicate that they were in the clinical range. So it's a
So-
similar profile, but not exactly the
so
same.
you don't know what the profile was, for example, with regard to DSP?
It was below clinical.
Why don't you tell me what the number was?
I don't know. She did not report
Well,
numbers.
where would you have that?
Where would I have it?
Yes, you
I
reviewed
would
it.
not have her number unless somebody gave me her actual results. I have her report.
So with regard to John Breer, we were talking about him. One of the things that you said that with regard to this profile that we're looking at, that this to you talks to trauma, not to personality, right?
In general, yes.
Are you familiar with the statement from Mr. Breer who indicates that in a psychiatric inpatient sample, TSI scales identified 89% of those independently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Are you familiar with that?
Not offhand. I'd have to see the article or...
Sure, let me
that.
show it to you.
Thank you.
Exhibit 652.
Again, could you tell me what your question was?
Are you done looking at it?
Yes, sir.
If I'm going to have it back.
Yes, sir.
Doesn't he indicate under his psychometric summary that in a psychiatric inpatient sample, TSI scales, these are TSI scales, correct?
Yes, sir.
Identify 89% of those that have already been independently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Isn't that what he says?
Well, first, no, that's not necessary. I don't know if that's...
No, sir, let's take a look at Exhibit 652 and see whether or not that sentence is included there, yes or no?
You're asking me 2 questions.
No, I'm asking you whether that sentence is there. Take a look at it.
You asked me if John Briere said that.
Well,
This is a...
let me go ahead and have it back.
Excuse me.
This does talk about John Breer, PhD at the top, doesn't it?
Yes, he's the author of the test.
And it does indicate that it's copywritten, right?
Excuse me. Yes, sir.
And it talks about the validity scales of the TSI, right?
Yes, sir.
And this talks about the clinical scales, right?
Yes, sir.
It's on his letterhead, isn't it?
I thought it was on PAR letterhead. If you let me.
Pardon?
I thought it was on the test publisher's letterhead. I'd have to look
You see
again.
the letterhead there? Whose name there is there?
It's not his letterhead. It looks like his website.
It may be his website, but it is his letterhead, right?
I can't answer that yes or no. I don't really know. That doesn't look like his letterhead. It looks like his website.
Judge, I move for the admission of 652.
You may.
denying that this publication was put out by this individual, John Greer, PhD?
I'm not denying it. I haven't seen that. It looks like it
So
might.
the answer is no, you're not denying that.
I'm not denying it, no.
So when you see the name at the top of that, you don't have any reason to have any suspicion that it was not put out by him.
Judge, may the witness actually review the entire document?
No, you can inquire on redirect. May continue.
What did you ask again? Do
You
I have any
no reason to
suspicion?
believe that this was not put out by John Greer, PhD.
I don't have reason to believe either way, actually.
So the answer is, you do have a reason to believe that he didn't put this out.
No, I can't tell you anything. I'm not familiar with that particular
And
document.
with regard to the second page, we were talking about the sentence. Isn't it true that it says, similarly, in a psychiatric inpatient sample, TSI scales identified 89% of those independently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Does that sentence exist?
Yes, sir.
And that goes against what you told us in terms of this being more of a traumatic kind of test, right?
No. You're, again, confusing different issues. One is you've asked me whether there's a study that supposedly exists that says it helped identify versus this test.
All right, let's
is
talk
not.
about that study. Are you saying,
Judge, he's interrupting. Can the witness finish?
let's talk about the study. Are you saying that it is your opinion, that, and your opinion is the one that governs, that this does not indicate, or it has no correlation to borderline personality disorder?
No, the study is obviously related. It's
Yes or
about
no?
borderline personality. So it's a double negative. I can't say I don't agree that the study is about borderline when it's obviously about borderline. So I'm not sure. You worded it in a way that sounded like a double negative. So if you could clarify, I could answer.
And you were asked a double negative by defense counsel previously. Do you remember even commenting that on direct examination?
And I believe I asked to clarify.
And you had no problem answering that. Do you remember that?
No, I believe I asked to clarify and I rephrased
And you
it.
clarified your answer without clarifying the question. Do you remember that?
In that one, I was allowed to clarify.
Sir, isn't it true that you told us that, in your view, there is no correlation between this, what we're looking at here, and borderline personality disorder? That's what you told us, right?
Objection foundation as to this. What is this?
Sustained.
Exhibit number 646. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes, sir?
You were the person who laid the foundation, right?
Yes, sir?
And this is the exhibit that we've been talking about.
Yes, sir.
Were you confused about what the this was?
No, I was not.
So with regard to this particular exhibit, 646, isn't it true that you told us previously that this profile, for lack of a better term, had no correlation with borderline personality disorder?
No, sir, I did not say that.
So are you saying then that it does correlate with borderline personality disorder?
No, I'm not saying either. You're asking different questions than what I answered before, and so I can't answer it.
Let me do it this way. Are you saying then that this correlates with borderline personality disorder? Yes or no?
I'm not answering either way. I'm not saying yes or no.
You can't answer that?
Correct.
And does that correlate with post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes.
Even though John Greer, the person who created this test, indicates that in a sample,
Objection asked and answered.
TSI scales identified 89% of those independently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. You're still saying that?
Am I saying which? Yes, I'm saying that there's a study that you've quoted. I haven't seen it, but I don't dispute it, that has used this and it indicated there is a correlation, which is a separate question from saying, is this test used to diagnose borderline? Those are two separate issues.
And I'm asking you about correlation. Didn't I just ask you that? Isn't that the word that I just used?
Correct. That's the word you just used, not the word I used before.
Right, and I'm asking you the question, whether or not there was a correlation between this test and borderline personality disorder. That was the word that I used, right?
Yeah, and this study, not having read it, but this study would suggest there is.
And if that study were true then, and there is this correlation, your criticism of Janine DeMarte's work then would be less valid, right?
No, sir.
So you still stick to your criticism even though there are studies out there that you may not be familiar with?
You're asking again two different questions.
No, that's not what I'm at. I'm asking you to answer my question. Isn't it true, sir, that even though there may be studies out there that indicate that looking at this test may be something that's important in deciding whether or not there's borderline personality disorder, you're saying you're discounting that, right?
No, the answer to the first part of your question is no. That is a completely different question, what you just stated, from what you stated after that. To say that a test...
To say what?
To say that a test like this is used to diagnose is not what that study says, or should be used that way.
We all agree that you've said, and everybody agrees, that these tests do not you can't just use them solely to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Correct.
Or borderline personality disorder, right?
Correct.
That's what you said, and those are the two items that we've been talking about, right?
Yes, sir.
But when you were talking about this TSI as it applied to Janine DeMarte, one of the things that you took issue was her using that test to determine whether or not, in her mind, based on what she saw there and all the other data that she had, whether or not to her that indicated borderline personality disorder, right?
Yes, sir.
Even though there are tests out there or there are studies out there that say that there is a correlation, correct?
Objection misstates the test. Foundation.
There, again, you keep using different questions. There is, according to that, I haven't seen it, but according to the study that you just quoted or something, a test, I'm sorry, there's a study that indicates there's a correlation that is different from saying that test should be used to identify. Those are like apples and oranges that you keep asking me, which is why I'm having difficulty giving you a yes or no, because it's yes to one, it's no to the other.
But isn't that something to consider? If there's a test, if there's a study out there that correlates this test with borderline personality disorder, don't you think that that's part of the general intelligence out there that should be considered? Or is that?
Well, there's a correlation between PTSD and borderline.
No, I'm not asking that.
I
I'm
know.
asking in terms of